All right, we'll go ahead and get started on our work session for May 23rd, 2017. The agenda is very straightforward. One item, we're going to have a discussion and presentation and discussion by Town Manager Greg Ferguson of the proposed budget ordinance. It's our first chance to sit down and talk about it. We'll run as long as we have to up until the 6:30 regular board meeting. So I'll take a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. And just be noted, Commissioner Warner has read the text. I don't know if he's on his way yet or not, but I'll keep you posted on that. Before we turn it over to Mr. Ferguson, we should all keep in mind that this is kind of a two-step process for us this year. We are going through the statutory requirement of getting a budget in place, and then as Mr. Ferguson completes his evaluation and assessment of where we are as a town, we as a board and a leadership team with Mr. Ferguson will come back in the late July, early August, mid-August timeframe, have a retreat to discuss any changes we think may need to be made, and probably have a budget amendment at that time to realign based upon his assessment. So with that, I'll turn it over to Greg, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, let me do something to recognize the folks that have been a key part of this budget process so far. Our previous manager, Warren Wood, played a very important role in trying to put this document together before he moved on to Hickory. Leonard Barefoot served as the interim manager and had a very important role in helping to get the final document prepared for tonight. And with our finance department has helped us pull it together, and Kelly has helped out as well, along with the efforts of our department heads who early in the process submitted their needs and ideas for the coming fiscal year.
Thank you for recognizing all of them.
Let me ask you to do something a little bit different. I wasn't going to do this, but I do want to go to page 24 in your booklet. Page 24 lays out the budget calendar and gives kind of the big picture to-dos. This year, as the mayor noted, we've added one additional step to that process, which is we have suggested, and the board seems to be working with the consensus, that we'll have a retreat sometime probably in August. I would ask that you look at your calendars tomorrow and email Kelly if you have not thought about the August time frame of what you might be doing in August. If there are dates that you're going to be traveling or that you be inaccessible for some reason, you'll let her know. We need to get that scheduled so that there can be some certainty to travel plans for the summertime for both the board, the mayor, and staff. So if you'll do that tomorrow, we'd like to get that calendared pretty quickly so we don't hamper travel. So that being an extra date, we've kind of added that as an August time frame for a retreat, and then there would likely be at a following meeting a budget amendment if there are decisions made that would impact the budget. So with that, let's go back to the PowerPoint, and we're going to walk through this.
So you'd like us to comment on dates between August 1st and August 18th, basically the first 3 weeks?
Ideally, that would be preferable.
Okay, thank you.
And with that, we'll go into the PowerPoint, and then we'll walk through the document itself and have questions. If there are specific questions as I go through, feel free to interrupt and just ask. We're going to go back just over the fundamentals of why we do a budget. One reason is we're required by state law to do it, but there are some other purposes that a budget serves. It's more than just some line items. These are really planning documents. They're policy documents. It's a strategic document to lay out what we want to do from a capital planning and equipment planning phase, or just long range planning as well. Some of the plans and studies that we've done before inform us on actions that we need to take moving into the future, and so the budget actually funds those actions. It certainly is a management tool. It helps us to manage our resources. It helps us to manage our people. It gives us goals through dollar figures that are attached to certain ideas, programs, and equipment. It helps us speak to the public and explain what we're doing with tax dollars. It It gives details that they might not otherwise see or know about, and it gives rating agencies, if we do that in the future, some idea of our financial management. Several things are looked at as we're building a budget. Certainly our vision statement informs the overall goals and objectives, mission statement. Our strategic initiatives, we're going to work through some of those and talk about those at the retreat and try to focus on a small subset of the total strategic initiatives. We've got those down, we know what they are, but we need to prioritize and put some timelines with a few of those and really focus on getting a few done quickly versus advancing a lot and seeing incremental small steps. So we want to talk about that at the retreat with you. Sort of like goals, part of our budget process, goals and objectives, and then other master plans that we've had adopted in the past that have had citizen input. So things like what happens in the downtown, how do we fund pedestrian projects, our parks plans, how do we get those implemented? So all those are part of building a budget. And then lastly, financial policies, things that we're going to try to do and not do from a budgeting standpoint. One is protect our fund balance to the extent possible. We want to maintain and keep a healthy, strong fund balance. A strong fund balance gives the board options as you move forward, but it also gives you protection in the event of an economic downturn or some other unforeseen circumstance where funds are needed. Our policy right now is I believe a 35% goal. We're currently a little under that this day and time, so we need to work to get that back up to that 35% objective. I believe at one point 50% was a stated objective. For a town of our size, in my opinion, 50 is probably a better goal if we could move it in that direction. As your budget increases and gets larger, we certainly could back down that percentage and work with a smaller amount. But right now, with the limited dollars based on the size of the budget, we are under the 35%. This is an overview of our various funds, and as you notice, the general fund is by far the largest of the operating funds. That's where police, park and rec, most of the things that you think of when you think of municipal services come out of the general fund. You'll notice that this year the general fund percentages go up. This projected budget over the current year budget, the main reason for that is there were some capital projects that were funded last year that are not existent, are not funded in this year. If you look at that line number 2, capital projects fund was 1 million and change, and now it's 650 in the projected next year. So that's a decrease there. The other big thing, there was a grant, that TAP grant for downtown, $1 million in the year we're in currently, went to zero. So we don't have a grant that's projected that's of that size at this time. Those are the big changes there that actually makes the percentages and the dollar figures a little bit different. The projected, or the budget shows no change in tax rate.
Just a curiosity question on that last one, just for purposes of clarity. If you could go back to that chart. The grant fund at 1 million, a little over 1 million, was the TAP grant.
That's correct.
We have that money accrued somewhere else because we haven't started to implement it yet, though, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Now, one thing about the TAP grant, and this will go to the fund balance discussion in part, is the TAP grant is a matching grant. So there's about $1 million match there. The $500,000, I'm sorry, not $1 million, a $500,000 match there. That $500,000 from the town will have to be spent first. So we will have to advance those dollars before we see the state monies come in.
Thank you.
Property tax rate is suggested to be unchanged, which means that the homeowner that owns a $300,000 house would have about a $1,080 tax bill, and you can do the math on taxes or houses that are of less value or greater value there. We do continue to see strong growth in the property tax base, mostly residential. The town is working diligently to look at the commercial base and to see if there are things that can be done to help balance some of the base. I think our numbers right now are about 92% residential. A goal would be to move that to a lower percentage. I'm currently trying to assess what some of those options are, but we would long-term want to move 92 to a good bit lower if we could. There is the third year of the fund balance appropriation for YMCA Fields. This is the partnership there. This is part of the funding. This is not the entire funding. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but there is additional debt that would likely have to be issued, and there are some funds that are set aside in the budget this coming year as recommended to address part of that debt, but not all that debt. So we'll talk about that a little bit further. As you have discussed previously with former manager Wood, there are 5 full-time positions that have been somewhat reserved, and that decision has been moved to a later date based on discussions with the board and the manager and department heads and needs. There were 12 or so positions requested by various departments, so you will see that 5 is not it's not 12, but there's really not been a decision made whether it would be 5 or 4 or 3. So that's something that we will move forward with based on some discussions with you. The current number for employees 67.5 part-timer there, or part-time hour. Operationally, we're doing the things that we're recommending doing the things that we're doing this year. The fundamentals of municipal service, police protection, animal control, certainly. You are aware that the fire department is supported in the acquisition of a vehicle which they have acquired and they're using. So that occurred this year, or is projected to occur next year. Parks and Recreation, certainly. We're looking at several fields and opportunities to try to speed those up. Events and festivals, and we'll talk about that a little bit as far as what makes up those numbers, and some changes this year where dollar figures were in the downtown budget, but they were moved over into the event budget to reflect some changes there. Downtown development, certainly a key component. Building inspection services, and then things like stormwater. We had calls today. We had areas of downtown. We had areas in Kensington, Millbridge that had issues today, but we had a tremendous amount of rain in a short period of time, and that's to be expected. So staff went out and addressed some of those, took pictures of some of those, and we'll kind of go back and see what we can do for the future. Sidewalk is something that, while you will not see in this budget yet a line for it, there is a community development block grant that will likely be an amendment to this budget as that moves forward in the process, in the award process. That was a 100% funded project that was coming from the county, so that did not require a match, which is good news, but we're not showing it yet in this budget because there's some approval steps and timelines and things that have to be developed.
And that's for out Waxhaw Marvin?
It goes from the downtown area over Highway 75 west over to Waxhaw Marvin. Okay. And we'll, as we get it, we'll put the scope out and some information on that, exactly what that means. We will continue to work on maintaining the residential streets, taking an inventory, making sure that we're aware of the current condition, and then as those need to have maintenance occur to them, try to improve our capacity to do that. Additional street lighting. And you'll see some downtown that would be added, and that downtown street lighting will be added in conjunction with the TAP grant. So that's really currently on hold to tee it up with the TAP grant to try to make sure that we don't tear sidewalks up more than one time, and that when we do make sidewalk improvements, that we're leaving it aesthetically in good shape. No changes are proposed right now in any of our solid waste or recycling. We do have a number, and we'll talk further with you about maybe some implementation at some point of what a residential 96-gallon container would do. That goes to a bi-weekly cycle, but it comes with additional cost. So that's something we'd like to talk about maybe at the retreat and get some feedback and input. That could be implemented at various times of the year, but we do have a number for that. Yard debris, that method is not being proposed to change any, and same thing with junk removal and white goods. And then the leaf removal program would continue. Moving into capital, there are some capital items that are in this year's budget that you'll see continue and roll over into next year because some will not be completed. So we'll try to highlight a couple of those. But first of all, we're replacing cars and vehicles as needed, and other vehicles. The police department has a request for 4 vehicles. 2 of those vehicles are placed directly into the police department's budget. 2 of those vehicles are in the reserve line for the manager to work through that process as we go through that personnel discussion about the other positions. I think there are several police positions are requested as part of the 12, so we need to sort through that and determine how those cars match up with however many positions end up. Kensington Drive, there's about 1.2 million that remains after some work has been completed. Phase 2 of Kensington Drive, which is the removal of some of the on-street parking and improvements between the shopping center and the intersection, is in the planning stage right now. And so there are additional dollars to be spent. That does not necessarily align with the full 1.2. That we'll have to clarify exactly how much will go to this phase 2 project. $350 for the YMCA project. That's going to, with the previous 2 years, have enough dollars maybe to get us started on that project. But we do not have a firm, solid, total project cost on that yet. And so we'll work to develop that and then look at funding strategies for how to move that project forward. There is, as I understand, a timeline constraint on that project, and part of the commitment there. So we do need to move that project along. The TAP grant I mentioned previously, that rolls forward. And then Town Creek Park, there were dollars appropriated this year that we have not spent yet. So we'll look at that, what those improvements could be, enhancements to that park. Certainly that's something that we'd like to move on quickly because the dollars are sitting in this year's budget. So that's something that we need to figure out what the answer is on that and how that could be utilized. But because it's in this year's budget, we'd like to move that quickly. I mentioned the downtown streetlight replacement project, $150,000 on that project. There are options on that project, whether we purchase or lease the lights. Staff has talked about some of those options there. There are pros and cons to both approaches. And so because we don't operate our own utility system, it may be that the leasing approach might be better from a long-term maintenance standpoint. If we had our own utility, I would probably recommend straight that we own the lights and we maintain them ourselves, but we don't currently.
The decision was made to wait and then do the lights at the same time as the TAP grant. So for that reason, the 150 that's in there now will be encumbered for that purpose, and then we'll start the next coming year with the TAP grant. And if it turns out to be
Yeah, there really hadn't been a final decision made on lease versus purchase, but we're gathering information and weighing the pros and cons on both. And there are definitely pros and cons with both approaches.
Ask a question. The improvements in Town Creek Park, does that have to be to Town Creek Park or could it be to any park?
By board action, you could change it to any park. I think in the existing budget, there was a line item that mentioned Town Creek Park, and it was attached to Town Creek Park. But the board can make a decision to do a different project with that money. It would be a board action. Staff would look to get direction on that.
What?
Your microphone wasn't on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Dan? There is included in this proposed budget $85,000 worth of debt service that would go toward additional improvements at the YMCA park. That would only fund about $1 million loan at $85,000. We really probably need at least $2 million additional, so that's half. So there's a gap there that we've got to identify to move that project forward.
My recollection from talking to Warren, his intention was to fund half a year on $2 million. I think he believes you all may have better agreed that anticipated cost was about $3 million. There is a number, and it's not, I believe looking at the timeline, it will be sometime in the second part of the year.
And that'll go back to really the big picture question of how many other projects would need financing and how quickly will they move along. We're trying to assess that. The difficulty with road projects is that they have a very long timeline and a horizon that's years versus months. So I'm working with Dennis to try to get our arms around the various road projects that are either already underway or have been tentatively funded by CRTPO, and then look at really the reality of whether we would move forward using some of those funding opportunities. CRTPO looks like they're teed up to fund the Gray Byram intersection, but that is a major project as it was proposed with right-of-way acquisition, new alignment, and you have three corners of that intersection that really could be redeveloped. So that's going to be a timing question as to, are there options there as far as dropping in a stop signal or signal there intermediate, or so we're working through some of those type of questions. And then capital reserve, this says $300,000 reserve funding for capital. That really is earmarked for Nesbit. So even though it's under the capital reserve label, it's not going to stay in capital reserve very long if you approve moving forward with something at Nesbit for improvements. I think there's the need for parking, a restroom, and sidewalks were, I think, part of what was envisioned with that fund. And that is the PowerPoint. What I'd like to do, if you have questions, take some of those and then kind of walk through what's in the booklet and talk about anything else that we need to gather. I do have some information about events, special events budget, and how actually what you'll see in the budget is that that number has increased. It's increased in part because of a couple things that have occurred. One is the year-over-year ongoing events were roughly $165,000, and then there were some events that were currently in the downtown budget, the First Fridays, that have been reclassified and moved over into the special events area. So that's about a $12,000 increase in that area. And then there are some Christmas decorations and replacement of lights on top of some of the buildings downtown. That has added some one-time expense, but also there's some annual expense there too. So there's about $15,000 worth of holiday enhancements, or however you want to call that, whether it's lights or getting the decorations ready and various things, some of which we do, I believe, annually, some of which may be a one-time expense that would last 4 or 5 years and then need to be replaced for lighting. And with that, if we're ready, we can transition over into the document that's in front of you. We do have an organizational chart that is in the process of being redone. It'll be, the final version of the budget will have a nicer looking chart. Structurally, boxes have not changed, with the exception of, at your last meeting, I believe there was a note that the town attorney and boards and committees boxes were kind of not where they need to be, so we have adjusted that and got a couple of little extra lines on here that'll go away once we get it formatted, that are diagonal lines, but for some reason are stuck on there, so we'll get that cleaned up. We go back through just some basics up front. You'll recognize that this is information that we provide to basically to the citizens, to the public, so that they understand what we're doing with the budget document. So if you'll go ahead and jump to page number 8, that's actually the budget message. So that's my letter of transmittal to you as the board, some of the highlights of this budget. And so it recognizes that there's a statutory requirement for the manager to provide a recommended budget to the town board each year. Talks a little bit about the process of getting to where we're at with Manager Wood leaving and Leonard being here. And then talks a little bit about some of the challenges that we are working through as an organization and a community. Page number 9 mentions some of the things that we're working on as far as addressing the town's growth. I will say that all those things are not completed. Many of them are work in progress, but they're having resources and time and staff attention. Midway down page 9, again, it gives you a total for the budget, gives you a little bit more information. It's a 12% decrease from the current year, and it mentions those capital projects that have been completed or they're encumbered, so that attributes, or there's a lot of reasons for the reduction there. It mentions the tax rate again, the collection rate, and the collection rate can only be established based on what your prior year, and there's a state law in place for that. So if it goes up or down, you can adjust that, but there's a formula for how that works, and so we follow that. Mentions the general fund, certainly the largest. The chart that we saw on the screen is again part of the budget there. And then we talked a little bit on page 10 about the revenue picture. The good news is our revenues are doing pretty well. But the bad news is that some of our revenues are somewhat volatile. So anytime we have a planning fee, a building inspection fee, or even our auto levy is susceptible to adjustments and changes and dips in the market. So if people are not buying cars, or they're keeping their car longer for economic reasons, whatever, the assessed value goes down, and you'll see a drop perhaps in vehicle taxes, motor vehicle taxes. The good news on the investment revenue is up slightly, not a lot, but a little tick up. And the good news though is that we're about $520,000 increase is the projection, and so that's 5.1% overall. And again, the town's property tax base is carrying the load. One assessment that I've already made on our fee side is that certainly because we have a building inspections program and we have some of those, we have a long schedule, and we'll talk about those in a moment. We certainly have park and rec fees, but absent those areas, we're not a very fee dependent town in that there are other fees that we don't assess. That's not saying that it's good or bad, it's just a decision philosophically, how you want to approach that in the future. And so there's some of those fees that we'll present for your thought process and consideration for the retreat, for future budget processes. And there's not a yes or no answer that's right. There's just, those are tools in your tool bag to address growth needs, planning needs, just the overall municipal operation. There are certain fees in North Carolina that we don't have the authority to have, and some communities have special legislation to assess impact fees. Most communities in North Carolina do not, but nationwide, many or some states do have those particular tools, but we don't have those. That in some cases does kind of hamper high growth areas planning for the high growth, but we have the tools that are approved by the General Assembly and as tweaked by the General Assembly from time to time. Our assessed value, you'll see it at the bottom of page 10, is right at 1.83 billion. But along with that 1.83 billion in total value comes additional responsibility, and that's in the form of increased house counts for trash pickup, recycling, traffic issues. You go right down the list. Those are people that need services. So sales tax looks good, but again, that is a volatile revenue, and along with the planning and building fees. So we don't want to ever get in a position where we absolutely are counting on 100% of what we took in last year. We want to be conservative, and if we knew a big development was coming and there were going to be a lot of fees, then we would be a little bit more aggressive in that approach. But overall, we want to be conservative in that area. And the personnel highlights there, middle of page 10, we do have a merit program in place, and so that gives you the figure there and the target goals for meet standards and exceed standards, and then the 5 positions that could be funded at a later date. Then at bottom of page 11, we go and do speak about the $32,000 that is changing in the special events recommended line. And I gave you verbally a little bit of an explanation about that previously. And then we've got consulting as far as marketing. Those are rolled into one functional area now. We had them, I think, spread out among several areas in the budget. So in order to track that, we've got it in one location. And then on the top of page 12, you'll see that we're projecting that there's going to be an additional number of houses serviced during the year from residential or solid waste, and that adds about $95,000 to the next year's budget just to service those new houses as they come online. There's a contingency amount set aside, has been the practice in the past. As the board and the manager work together at the retreat, there may be some items that you decide that we want to take and fund or modify something, so that there is some flexibility there. Middle of page 12, I'm just going to skip down to some of the things there. You talked about external agency funding. We did address that, and Leonard and I went through and looked at your instructions to us, which was to take $35,000 and to appropriate that. The numbers that you see represent, I believe, about 65% of the request as the organizations made it. We do understand that there are some of the organizations that probably don't offer the same value to the town as an organization, and may offer more value to the town and the county, and maybe the county is getting more value out of that. So the two of us, being somewhat new to the area, couldn't make value judgments on which one is weighted better. So we took an approach of if we have $35,000 and have to apply it, there's a formula to do that, and we worked into 65% funding. Certainly if the board desires, you can adopt a different way of doing that, but that's the method that we chose to recommend to you. Going forward, we've got a couple other highlights there. We do have our legal contract. our audit is requested to be extended for a single year and use the same firm that we've used before, but then there'll be a question about, do we want to put that out for bid? But we are proposing a one-year extension on that, so. The third year of the Buxton retail contract is funded. I've taken a look at that and understand a little better what we're doing in that strategy. We're working with the EDC folks and their newly created retail person that has not been hired yet, I don't believe. And our contribution, as I understand it, is because we have the Buxton contract in place, we can provide some data to that organization, and so we're not paying a fee like some of the other communities might be paying. So I've kind of learned a little bit about that. So we'll likely have the Buxton folks visit with us in July. Talk with Kurt a little bit about the possibility of bringing Buxton here, or no, I'm sorry, talking at our June second meeting with you a little bit about that retail component. So we're trying to determine, given the budget work session and where we're at in adopting the budget, if we'll have time for that. But one thought process is probably have some discussion with the board in June about the whole retail component, and then maybe invite Buxton to come back on July 11th and get us all up to speed. Is that fair? Okay. Street lighting expenses. Well, going back to resurfacing, we're going to do some Powell bill work this coming year. If I recall this correctly, there's a revenue line that says about $300,000 as a Powell bill appropriation. So this is only showing spending 2/3 of that, but there are opportunities for other uses of that Powell bill fund, and we need to build it up as much as we can, but we have needs, as y'all are very aware of, in resurfacing.
And looking at the detail, it looks like we're going to spend $405,000 this year. So we were playing catch up with some of the needs. So job well done by the staff on that to help us get caught up.
Street lighting, those are ongoing costs. So once we put them in place, we have to pay for them, or we accept them if someone else has started it in a subdivision and they've bought down the decorative light and they've turned them over to the town, then those become an annual expense. The recycling and waste contract there, that's kind of the total projected number. This year it was 900 and change, so now we're over $1 million, and that's building in that additional number of houses. We do have some costs with the rental town hall listed there. Tree City USA and then Village News are some smaller items.
On the town hall rental, have you addressed, or where are we at on the lease process? I know when we started, we were at a certain so many years and then a couple of extensions.
So the lease runs out this year, but we have the option to give notice that we request a 2-year extension. We will do that pretty soon. I believe the date on that lease is October, if I'm around first part of October. So we would want to give a notice pretty soon and maybe explore whether or not a 2-year extension is enough, whether we perhaps suggest that we request a 3-year extension. There are some options as far as moving forward on a town hall, whether we stayed there for 2 years or 3 years. Those again are going to need some input and feedback from the board as to different directions that we might take that.
Should that be a retreat item, and then talk about town hall, what the desire is for going forward?
Yes.
All right.
And certainly there are property questions that you might want to take offline just so that we wouldn't identify what those might be. So.
Okay, thank you.
Curiosity question, Tree City USA, does that say we're getting back into it this year? Because we stepped out because we were given it lip service.
There are, let me see if I can say this correctly. There are annual costs that we have that fit within that category whether we are officially doing it or not.
Fair enough.
So that may not answer the question completely, but that's as I understand it.
Clear as it'll be.
Just to clarify that, that has to do with the city arborist and what fee we pay for him, et cetera, right?
That
Under that.
answer I do not know.
Yes, and trees and shrubs.
Okay. Any type of tree maintenance that we do.
And education.
Okay, going on page 13, two big capital items are the YMCA project and then the other 300,000 that was earmarked tentatively for Nesbit. And as I mentioned, I think that was a project that would include some sidewalk, a restroom, and some parking enhancements. The need for additional monies to be appropriated toward
By the time we get to the retreat, will we have the information available to, because we've been, for lack of a better way to say it, spoon feeding Nesbit every year. Will we be able to discuss Nesbit and some others? What's it going to take to bring them to completion, if you will?
So what I'd like to do at the retreat is have I kind of call it a war board. It's got all our projects up on it, and we talk about what your priorities are as a board. There's a lot of projects out there that have some opportunity, but we need to get focused on one or two and do them right. And it may be that we do them in phases, but we just need to go ahead and identify what those are and what those phases are if we have to break it up into phases. We have consultants working on some of these plans. On others, we need to figure out who needs to help us with that. The Park and Rec Commission certainly, or the feedback is valuable as well as to what goes and when. There's some questions about property that the board's going to have to make, and depending on what those answers are, you might have funding for additional enhancements that we really haven't identified yet. So those things are all kind of blended together, but I think the retreat, we may need to bring in land design or some of the folks who have worked on the plans before to answer specific questions. The concern I have right now is the bidding environment that we're in is super competitive, but it's also an environment where bidders might not bid, and if they do bid, they're padding their bids quite a bit. So,
And then we have the additional, I know we ran into it on Kensington, if you go too small, you can't get anybody to look at it because we don't have a big enough chunk to bite off.
yeah, that's an absolute problem right now, and it's in this market, it's in this region. If it's not a big project with a pretty nice profit margin on it, they'll go work for somebody else, and so that's just the environment.
So, on the next thing, where it's still there, I guess the next paragraph under capital highlights, it talks about the $85,000 being appropriated for payment towards the $2 million loan needed to construct. So, there's a $2 million loan. A year and a half ago, we set aside $350 per year for the next 3 years. So that's 3-point-something million. Okay, is there ever going to be a point in time when we get an estimate, or this is what the price is going to be?
Yes.
I don't know anything about it, but that's a way long miss from 1 million to 3 million. Just my,
Well, first, it wasn't a miss. We set aside money without any design or any plan put in place. We set aside so we could get the ball rolling long before the county agreed to donate nearly 4 acres to it as well. We're going to have some tough decisions as a board, but if you don't want misses, then we're going to have to add to the staff so we have people that can actually have the time and energy to plan these things out. We've got I'm much more worried about the miss we've had on Nesbit. We've been paying that one since we were on the planning board. So all of these are misses because of the way we've had to do this, if you want to put it that way. I think the other part of that is what he's really getting at. What do we want to prioritize? Then you can go put the stake in the ground and go build it and finish it. We haven't done that, which is the bigger challenge here.
So one of our goals is to come up with a project sheet for you on all the projects that we're talking about, so that we can keep track of it, and we have it in a handy format, so that if you're out, you're talking to a group, or you just want to remember that you have something that's been updated on a fairly regular basis, whether it's quarterly or bi-monthly or however we need to do that. But that sheet, and we're developing that right now and populating those sheets with the information, but that will help all of us stay on track. It'll help the department heads stay on track. You know, part of the question for some of the projects simply is, how do we think we're going to fund it? And in some cases, we don't have a clear answer. We've got to come up with that, or we've got to gather some information, and then we need to come back and give you options as to how we might fund some of the projects. But those sheets will clarify that. It also will show us, it'll give us a project overview, a picture of what we're doing in that particular project, a schedule as we know it today, where we're at in that schedule, and then we'll have estimated expenses, estimated revenues. And that'll lay out how that project could be paid for. Certainly over time, those projects change, and the good thing is, if you get it on paper and you make some assumptions, you can always change your assumptions. But if we don't have it down where everybody can look at it, then it's difficult for staff and for the board. So we're working on that. Hopefully we'll have those, at least some of those, done pretty soon, and we can start talking with you about those assumptions that we think as staff have been made and might be made moving forward. You'll see on page 13, the design and signalization of the Gray-Byram Highway 60 intersection. As I mentioned, the CRTPO has listed that project as number 6 on the direct allocation funding program. Number 6 is the final funded project on the list, so we made it, but barely. There are difficulties with that project in that we don't have right-of-way. It's a realignment. It's a pretty big project. There's also some questions as to what DOT might do in the future to 16 and how that design might impact something moving forward at that intersection. So we want to go eyes wide open as to if that project proceeded on the DA route with the regional money. Let's be careful that we don't design something that the DOT might come and remove whenever 16 is widened. And so the question that Dennis has talked with me today about, or yesterday and today, is, you know, what is the strategy, short-term and long-term, for that intersection? And we want to, you know, talk about what those are and the pros and the cons about both those moving forward. If we went forward with a smaller project, we might not have access to the CRTPO money. But if we did that, it might be a lot quicker. So there are definitely pros and cons to it. And in the road funding world, things are always changing. So I think that's an uncomfortable statement to absorb, but sometimes they change for the better and sometimes they change for the worse. Some projects, NCDOT will step in and kind of take over the project that the town might have started and do it because they can do it. That has pros and cons in that the price will probably go up if the DOT is following the DOT's prescribed process, and you lose more local control over that process. However, they may be funding more. So there's the trade-offs there. If we're funding a project internally and it's not an NCDOT road and we don't have to get their permission, those projects move quickly, but there are few of those. So,
Gray-Byram, both of them are DOT roads.
you know, the question there too is there are 3 corners that are undeveloped there at that intersection, and so do you get ahead of the development or do you wait and partner with the development? And how likely is that development to happen? You know, are there willing landowners, or are the landowners not interested in redevelopment at this time? All those questions we're trying to work.
Answer to both those questions is yes. Depending upon who you're talking to. And just for clarity for the board, that DA funding gets approved next month. It's a matching grant where we get 75% from the DOT and we match it with 25%. And the total amount, I think, and Dennis, you can correct me, I think it was like 3.1, 3.2 million, somewhere around in there, which says we're gonna put up $1 million on that, to make that work. That said, we can also borrow against that if we wanted to, but it puts all the burden on staff to drive it. You know, you can borrow against that, and when the money becomes available from the feds, we can pay off the loan that way. I mean, that's what he's getting at, the complexity of which way do you go? You gotta look at this and attack it, consistently, because it could take up a lot of time on Dennis and his team's part to try to take that on.
Yeah, these are big
We
projects.
we also have money designated from Landover for that intersection too, correct?
I'm hoping that's part of the 1 million that we have.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
That's my understanding, that there's some commitment there on that, but I have not seen a document, so I'm waiting to.
There is a document, yeah.
Capital replacement program, we've noted there that there are 2 police cars that are in the funded police budget, but we've also got 2 more that are potentially funded that are reserved. So there were 4, I believe, requested. All 4 in the budget, but 2 are in the funded police budget. We got 2 that are 130,000 miles plus, I know. And then there are 2 more that potentially could move forward, as well. But just because we've got 2 there, doesn't mean that we haven't listened and had some plan for addressing the full need there.
Can I just say on that, one thing we discussed, we need to have a better system. Define, we need better control of the vehicles and how we replace them. Rather than get 5 last year, I think it was, 5 years before. Do you know how they're being used and completed? We buy 5 every year and then wait 5 years. The needs that you won't have, it's systematically replacing vehicles.
I believe it was my understanding that there was a protocol, a system in place that for some reason was stopped at one point. Right.
Yeah, one of the things that we would suggest is that we take a look at how we fund those too. There are some options out there for funding, but the other part of it is there is a great benefit, and it's a good benefit. We'll see it more so rolling forward in maintenance reduction as we keep newer cars in the fleet. Our maintenance costs are actually trending down, so that's a good thing that is a result of keeping up to date and kind of having a replacement schedule and sticking to it. And that's sometimes tough to do. I think every department everywhere probably cut back during the recession and either didn't buy cars or bought fewer cars, and everybody that did that knew that they were going to have a bubble come through and catch them later. So, and that was a valid strategy to try to survive for some communities, was just defer that problem till later, and they did, and they played catch up. But we want to get on a schedule to the extent possible and do that with all equipment, police cars, any other public service trucks. We've got one public service truck that's pretty old, needs to be replaced. We need to get those all and try to stick to schedules as best we can, knowing that in any particular financial or budget year, there's some tough choices to be made sometimes, and there may be some trade-offs where in one year we are able to fully get one department fixed up, and then the next year it's another department's turn. So we'll just have to assess that and try to figure it out as we move forward.
Leonard, your comment was about overall the entire fleet, not just picking on a department.
Yeah, the entire fleet.
Yeah.
This is the one where there are cars being bought 3 years in a row.
Okay.
Or, you know, you can get a lot more miles out of it than
And actually, when we first sit down 3 years ago, coming up on 4 in December, that was the first thing that was brought to us in the budget, that the fact that they were so far behind in the police department, and then when that was presented, it was also recognized the rest of the departments also. And I thought that there was a plan put back in place, if I don't,
Yeah, plus
I
we
recall
were
correctly.
buying, previously we were buying
Well, state troopers
previous
are-
state cruisers,
Right.
and they were not holding up very well. They already been used.
So there might be something documented somewhere that,
Well, we'll ask some questions about that and try to bring something forward if there's not one in place. If there is one in place, then we need to look at what schedule we're on right now with the other vehicles.
I would like to compliment Todd and Meredith.
Marion.
I requested that information, well, came to, they're the ones that maintain it, they did a very good job of that.
The bottom of page 13 does mention that 50% general fund balance. Really would like to work toward getting that back to that goal. You'll see on page 14, there have been some things acquired in the last few years that have driven that fund balance number down, mainly properties, but some other investments that have been made. We'd like to reverse that trend and try to stabilize it and head it in the other direction. From the 3.6 million shown at the end of FY16, there have been some further appropriations that you've made, so that number actually now is around 2.8, 2.9. So we'd like to work on getting it. The projection, as I believe it to be, and it is a projection, it's a work in progress, is that we will add some to the fund balance at the end of this year, but we've still got a long way to go.
So, maybe it's just my curiosity. Prior to fiscal year 14, 15, I believe, we did not have capital budgets. So everything went in the fund balance. Everything was unassigned. So on top of this 3.6 or whatever it is, what's the assigned balance that we have? So we can kind of compare it to the 8 million or the 6.7 million, actually, all the way back to fiscal year 13, 14, because it's not a apples to apples comparison.
We don't have that chart here tonight, but we'll
Okay.
pull that. Basically, what that chart will show will be the June 30 assigned fund balance for each of the years, and so we'll get that to you. And
I don't want to misconstrue things to the citizenry. That's the thing, because
that is a point to be made, is there are state required revenues that are restricted, and we can prepare that and get that chart that shows the complete picture.
Yeah.
Because this is not, we're not saying there's only $2.8 million in the bank.
Right.
That's not the message.
Thank you. Congratulations for making it to 23 days. I noticed that on the bottom of page
Yeah.
14.
Leonard pointed that out, that it was day number 23. I really appreciate the work of the staff, finance staff, town clerk's office, and Leonard to try to get this thing pulled together right here toward the end. It's important that we get it out for the public to take a look at, to give feedback at the public hearing, for you to have time to absorb it and ask questions and get answers. We are on schedule to have adoption in June as required by state statute. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and be able to take any questions that you still might have.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I mean, this is, it's a difficult situation you two have been thrown into in terms of trying to pull it together and trying to pull the historical perspective in it, so appreciate it. Questions?
Just a comment. Throughout the presentation by all of you, I noticed that there is an emphasis on completing items. That's very important. And I think that's very refreshing. And the only other question I would ask you right now is, will we be able to get back to having our informational meetings, say after Labor Day, where we can meet and go through some of the details of this? I know we need to come up with questions and go through it in public and so forth, but the informational meetings we used to have were very helpful.
Did you mean Memorial Day?
Memorial Day.
After Memorial Day, sorry.
Labor Day's the way out.
Yeah, no, we don't.
You
Sure.
get 2 months leeway?
Sir, I would suggest maybe a couple of work sessions, however many you feel like you need as far as if they're budgetary. Maybe everyone's not prepared tonight because we're just recommending this and you'll need time to absorb it, look at it and have some questions. My request to you is as you move forward, looking at the budget, looking at the contents, if there are questions, go ahead and send those in to us and let us start compiling a list of those questions and then get the data, the information together, and we can roll that into one kind of big document that would have everybody, any information that you need, and then we'll circulate that one document out and then use that as the basis for any other work session that you might want to schedule. A lot of times if we just get it on paper and get the answers on paper, it shortens the work session up tremendously.
Sure. Okay, that's fine, thank you.
I do think, going forward, though, that the opportunity to come in and, two of us or three of us and just brainstorm a little bit becomes very helpful. We are going to need a work session we're going to have to, in a very transparent way, come to grips with what do we want to do with external agency funding. We've talked about it, and we're going to have to make a decision here between now and June 11th or whenever the public hearing starts, and get some of that clarification out there. I realize we may not be able to do that tonight. Jim, you got questions?
No?
Okay. Brenda, do you have any for tonight, or?
Not yet,
Okay.
but I will.
Yeah. John?
On page 18, under the section 13, the town manager's authorized, is that new language, or is that standard, or is that what we currently have adopted?
That's been in the previous,
Okay,
at least it was in the previous one this year.
okay. That's just for the budget, as far as moving items around, that's not your other expenditure limits or anything like that? Okay.
Correct. So what that says, in a functional area, so police, I have the authority to move money from the gasoline fuel line to the tire line if we have that need. So we're going to keep that balance. If we're going to move something from a capital line to the Parks and Rec Department budget, that's got to come back to you.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Is there a limit, is there a limitation on what can you move?
Within a departmental budget, there is not. It requires the manager's sign off. So a department director, if they had a need, for example, when you approve the budget, you're approving this budget ordinance. So if you go back to page 16, you're approving it by area. So general government, 2.1 million, public safety, 3 million, go right down the line. So totals up to 10.9. Within those areas is where the manager is authorized to literally manage the budget. So with the department head's recommendation and the finance person's sign off, then a line that might have had dollars set aside for fuel or whatever can be moved if we have an expense that's come in high, like the electric. It's a cold winter and the electric bill goes much higher than what was anticipated. Part of our job is to manage that, and so we would identify areas where maybe we're going to do better. And one would be vehicle maintenance this year. We're doing better than what was projected, so that would give us the capacity to address the new need that occurs during a 12-month window.
Maybe something that we could ask you to do or ask Kelly to do is, back in 2015, we put as a strategic initiative, develop financial policies. We did that, and that, so it's no longer initiative. But maybe if you send a copy of what those policies are so we can all get refamiliarized with that, so we understand it better, because it's been put together, it's been adopted, and it's where the fund balance statement comes from and all that stuff, and we probably should get reacclimated to it. Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely. And I think the second part of that is we may have had it in here, and I may miss it, but if we did not include it, we'll get that out to you. And I think that, along with another discussion, is a retreat topic too, is are there tweaks or changes to those financial policies as we move forward that would put us in a position to look at debt service? And there's some things that rating agencies are going to want to see in that financial policy that says we know about this and here's our approach to debt. You know, what percentage of your total annual budget or your assessed value would you want to take on as debt? And so there are percentages and ratios there that if you get too high, will raise eyebrows. So we would want to err on the side of being on the lower end of that. There's a formula for how much total debt a community can issue. And so you know what your ultimate limit is, but nobody wants to get close to it, so you want to stay down. So we will work on that moving forward. We will likely have some assistance in the month of June looking at our debt capacity. So getting right to the heart of that, you know, what are we doing right now operationally? What do we have as potential debt capacity? And that will help inform us as we move into August as to some of the options that the board might have. Also, types of debt. So there's debt that's issued basically by a bank. That's one type of debt that you put out an RFP for. Then there are other types of debt that have to go to the voters in an election year. That's a slower process and probably is better addressing a larger number of projects that amount to costly dollars. So we'll bring some of that information to you and just talk about some of the options at the retreat.
Paul, do you have some questions this time?
I'm looking at this budget ordinance. Is it possible to find out what our current numbers are for this year against those, so we can know how much we're going up percentage-wise on each line item? Is that a possibility?
So yes, if you'll go to page number.
I haven't gone over the whole booklet yet. So.
Yeah, this gets toward the back, and the detail is there on page number 58. 58 will give you a current year budget number, so that's what's in the approved budget this year, and it'll give you a number for recommended next year. We certainly, if the desire to put some percentages beside that, we can do that as well. This is just kind of a very simple format to show this year that we're currently in, and then any proposed change or projected change. But that gets right to your revenues on page 58. And you'll see that there's some years where there's nothing plugged in there. So if you didn't pay your motor vehicle tax 2011, we really don't know whether you're going to pay it this year or not. So that column may end up with some revenue in it at the end of the year, but you really can't project that very well.
Just to be clear, the budget ordinance represents this year. And by law, we have to represent this year, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the budget ordinance is actually, when communities talk about we adopted the budget, they adopted the budget ordinance. The detail of what's in the budget ordinance starts on page 58. So those are revenue assumptions, and then those are some expenditure assumptions. So that's how we get to those numbers that are rolled up into the budget ordinance.
So what you'd like us to do is take the detail, take the document, get you questions by Tuesday next week, so you can begin to look at them, and we're going to probably need a work session the following week if we're going to talk about this stuff before the 11th in the public hearing. So there's no surprises. We vetted it and discussed it thoroughly. So is that reasonable to say by end of day Tuesday we can reach out to you and get stuff to you as best we can?
That works. What I would request
Another way,
request that you consider is maybe going ahead tonight and having some discussion about when that work session would be, and let's go ahead and set a target date for it while we're in the same room. And that might be quicker and easier than an email chain.
Yeah.
If we could go ahead and identify a date.
I'd ask that you not stick it on a Tuesday, June 6th, because that's our wedding anniversary, and we will have a significant budget amendment if, if we stick it there. That's your call, though. But that week of the 5th, and just FYI, I believe the county has their open budget discussion on the 5th. If anybody wants to go to that, so 7th or 8th, maybe?
Seventh's good for me.
7th, good? Others?
I can do the 7th.
Seventh,
7th?
Is there a time that you would like that would accommodate? 5 o'clock would be, because we do film the proceedings, would be good if we could start earlier rather than too late. But if there's a desire to push it into the evening hour, more so around 6:30, we could do that too.
This time as a work session works fine. Is that okay with everybody? 4:30?
4:30? That
Okay.
we'll work on the notice for that. There will be an agenda item then that needs to be added tonight, if you want to go ahead and call that or set that special work session for that date.
Okay.
For budget.
I'll work with you after this so we know what it changes to make.
So with-
When do we post this for public view?
Likely tomorrow. I believe we've got it in a format where that should not be terribly difficult to do. So we'll work on that tomorrow to have that information online as soon as we can.
And I may be the only one that feels this way. I'm nervous on page 14 with that unassigned fund balance because it's comparing apples to oranges. And that is going to get misrepresented.
Yep. Going to.
What we can do is before we post that online, make sure that we've got that assigned fund balance slide and perhaps just add it in this section and
Okay.
and put a little bit of clarification with that. So,
Because it truly is an apples to oranges kind of comparison. And
yeah, we'll work on doing that before we post it so that misunderstanding won't be out there.
Yeah, they blame us for draining it so dry. I can see that coming.
I think, absolutely, you have assigned projects and assigned capital that's not shown on that chart, so that,
Some of the money you all appropriated from the fund balance for property, or you have property, capital projects. This money is moved over to capital project funds, and they're funding the project on the borrowing side.
yeah, we just never did that as a town back where at the 8 million, the 6.75, we didn't categorize them that way.
They're there, but, you know, the unassigned is what's left. In other words, it's not gonna be as easy to go out and take $2 million, $1 million fines,
and certainly there are things that the town can do to provide additional flexibility in the fund balance, whether it's assigned or unassigned. One is that you could sell assets. There's that opportunity. You could also get contributions from developers, so that's an opportunity. You can partner with other governments or agencies, certainly for parks and for governmental facilities. There's always that option and opportunity. So in no way do I mean to say that it's a bad thing that the fund balance has gone down. I think the fund balance is a tool. And in some years you're able to add to fund balance, and some years you need to utilize those funds for their purpose, which is to be somewhat of an opportunity fund. So if you have a partnership or you have an opportunity that comes along because a piece of land suddenly becomes available, that's why you need that fund there. And the other part is that safety factor in that your taxes generally don't come in until December. Most people don't pay early. So you need money in your checking account to pay the bills and to pay your employees and not run close. So that's another reason to have a strong fund balance policy.
And then I would anticipate on the 7th that we will reach closure as a board on the external agency funding.
Just to go, just because we have a few moments, just if you start at page 16, that is the budget ordinance, so that's the part that's adopted, it's pages 16 through 18. There's some information for public consumption about the process and what the laws are in North Carolina that starts on page 19 and runs through the budget calendar on page 24. So that kind of lays out the process, or rather page 25. There's additional information about the different types of revenues. Local governments are not a simple business. They're a multi-revenue business, and we identify what some of those are. But of course, the biggest one is their property tax bill. So different than a normal business. Some of ours are also restricted by law. So Powell bill can't be spent on parks and recreation. It's got to be spent on road and road use, transportation uses. We talk a little bit on page 28 about the different funds in the budget and explain what those are. And then get into a little bit of information about the smaller funds there. What you also do when you adopt the budget ordinance is you refer to the pay and classification plan. That's on page 32 and 33. It also refers to the fee schedule, which begins in this particular document on page 38. And those are reviewed and updated as needed. And then we did, for summary purposes, on page 37, put the listing of the outside agency and the funding there that's contained in the budget. So it's just clear what that is and that it does equal $35,000. You'll see that the fire department and the economic development piece was pulled out per your direction at the last work session. So that's the 35 and how we got to it. And then at the very back of the document, there's a budget glossary that goes through some of the terminology that's used either in this presentation or in the budget document itself. Just if you're not familiar, or a citizen might not be familiar with restricted intergovernmental revenues and what that means, there's a definition back there for that.
Quick clarification question. Do we set the fire inspection fee schedule and then contract with the volunteer fire department to do the work? Or have we passed that all over to them? But we set the fee schedule and then we pay them, right? Okay, thank you. Yeah. You anxious for us to end this? or- Yeah. We'll recess and reconvene on the 6th when we, yeah. No, I appreciate you mentioning that. That's a good idea. One last question I have is, and I have not seen much from the League of Municipalities on this, but would it make any sense to have our attorney look to see if there's any proposed legislation that's going to impact fees and revenue structures to the municipalities? I have not kept tabs on that piece of it. I know there was some work. It shouldn't take too much time. I'm just wondering if there's anything there.
Let us review what they've sent out. The league does send out a recommendation as far as many of the revenues that we see, and that recommendation is usually general in its application, there are some specific revenues that they actually give us a very specific recommendation on. But let's go back and then we'll,
Yeah, I don't know if there's any proposed legislation that could help or hurt us at all. I mean, there's 1,400 bills, who the heck knows?
there's nothing that comes to my mind immediately that's out there, but there could be, and we can have that conversation.
Any other questions? If not, I'd like to, with your permission, recess this work session on the budget to June 7th at 4:30 PM.
If we recess, does that limit what we're able to do or take votes or anything if we need to take a vote
No?
versus a regular meeting?
No.
So we can
Just-
take a vote in a work session?
No, we're not taking a vote of the work session. We're just recessing the discussion of the budget, for continued discussion of the budget until the 7th at 4:30. We still can say we've accepted the budget as we are going to do this evening and set up the public hearing, which are the only two votes that we have to take at this point in time. We're not limited in being able to do that.
Usually those regular meetings.
Correct.
But if I understand the question, work session, you wouldn't, you can give direction to staff.
In reference to the external agencies or anything like that, we wouldn't have to have a vote on limit, or what we give them or anything to that effect. We just give them direction.
We give them direction, consensus.
Okay.
The vote would occur in the regular meeting.
One thing that I would request that we consider trying to do as a goal is to, whatever the final date of approval is in June for the budget, that we get it finalized before that night, so we do not have to make any changes to it that night. That to me, if we have it ahead of time and the public has time to look at a final document versus changing something the night of the vote, it doesn't send as good of a message to the public as we could if we can finalize it ahead of time.
So are you comfortable with the public hearing on the 13th, taking all that input, and then we finalize it that week, and we got a week and a half before the 27th, and we
Yeah.
adopt then?
Yes.
Okay. If we're okay with that, we'll recess this meeting until June 7th at 4:30.
Sitting all day long. Every time I stand up, I feel weird.